This is the American Ghost Fleet, a secret constellation of experimental orbital platforms that, according to recently declassified documents, was designed to do something unthinkable: create a permanent military presence in low Earth orbit that could manipulate the battlefield on the ground without ever firing a traditional weapon. If that sounds like science fiction or some kind of cosmic conspiracy theory, it shouldn't, because history has a way of warning us long before it repeats itself. And what you're about to hear is not a prediction of the future, it's the echo of a plan the United States quietly explored decades ago, hidden beneath layers of political theater, diplomatic smiles, and the most sophisticated misdirection of the Cold War. Let's start with the headline, "No one ever expected to be real." The United States once pursued the idea of an orbital manipulation system, part spy network, part defense shield, part psychological deterrent, that insiders compared to a silent hand over the battlefield. It wasn't designed to shoot missiles, blast lasers, or blow up satellites. It was designed to blind them, jam them, reroute them, and, under certain emergency conditions, push them off orbit entirely. It was, in essence, the opposite of Star Wars. Where Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative promised a dramatic laser show in space, the Ghost Fleet was meant to be invisible. Where the Soviet Polyus was a giant cylinder with a CO2 laser strapped to its spine, the Ghost Fleet aimed to be so quiet that most of the Pentagon didn't even know which department oversaw it. And just like with the Soviet Death Star, the world never knew how close any of this came to happening. But before we get lost in the orbit of secret projects, we need to go back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with the United States designing anything. It starts with panic, and panic is one of the most powerful engines in history. In the late 1970s, America was still recovering from the aftermath of the Vietnam War, political scandals, and a shaken national confidence. The Soviet Union, on the surface, appeared more open than ever. Leaders shook hands in public, ambassadors exchanged warm speeches, and television broadcasts insisted that cooperation was the spirit of the new era. But behind those carefully staged moments were intelligence briefings that told a very different story. American analysts had begun noticing irregular burn patterns in Soviet launch logs, short duration tests, unusual telemetry, orbital maneuvers that didn't match known mission purposes. Officially, the Soviet Union was launching experimental communication platforms. Unofficially, something didn't add up, and then came the revelation that changed everything. In 1979, a defector provided information that confirmed American suspicions. The Soviets had been experimenting with directed energy weapon concepts since early in the decade, not just handheld lasers for aircraft, not just ground-based prototypes, but actual testing modules that could, in theory, be mounted on future orbital stations. This was years before the public would hear a whisper about the Soviet Skiff project, years before Polyus, years before Reagan's Star Wars. Suddenly, the American intelligence community realized something terrifying. The future battlefield might not begin on land, sea, or air, but in orbit. This was the spark that would eventually ignite the Ghost Fleet. But fear is rarely straightforward, and to understand the magnitude of what came next, we need to examine the paradox that defined the entire era. A world publicly committed to peace, but privately sprinting toward militarization at a speed no treaty could possibly slow. By 1982, when Ronald Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, it was the public face of something far bigger. SDI was dramatic, loud, cinematic, lasers and interceptors, futuristic shields around the homeland. It was the kind of military dream that made headlines and inspired entire generations of scientists. But behind the curtain, separate committees were quietly exploring a very different question. What if real power in orbit isn't in the weapons you fire, but in the information you control? Because by the early 1980s, satellites had become the nervous system of the modern battlefield. They relayed signals, guided missiles, monitored troop movements, tracked submarines, and mapped entire continents from hundreds of miles above. Whoever controlled space didn't just control weapons, they controlled the ability to coordinate them. This is where the Ghost Fleet was born. It started as a fragmented study, a scattered series of memos between branches that rarely communicated with each other. But the common theme was undeniable. The United States needed an orbital presence that wasn't designed to shoot. They needed one that could silence. And that strategy was far more dangerous than any laser. Because lasers can be traced. Missiles have signatures. But jamming, redirecting, blinding, and hijacking signals, those are invisible acts. Ghost acts. A perfect geopolitical weapon because no one can prove who pulled the trigger. Which brings us to the twist, because every story like this needs one. Just when it seemed like tensions were cooling and cooperation was the new global brand, a classified report landed on the desk of senior intelligence officials. A Soviet spacecraft had emitted radiation bursts that matched early-stage testing of high-power optical targeting systems. The Americans panicked, assuming it was the sign of a directed energy weapon in development. In reality, it was nothing more than a diagnostic error from a failing sensor grid. But the United States didn't know that, and panic once again became momentum. The Ghost Fleet was quietly greenlit as a conceptual program. No big announcements, no press releases, no congressional fanfare. Just a simple directive: build a system that ensures no other nation can gain orbital superiority. The architecture they envisioned was bold. Not massive stations like Polyus, not bulky weapon platforms like SDI satellites, but a collection of modular autonomous nodes, small enough to hide among normal satellites, powerful enough to manipulate them. Nodes that could self-correct, self-propel, and adapt to new orbital conditions without human input. It was, for the era, almost absurdly ambitious, but before engineering could even begin, the first requirement had to be addressed: masking the project from the rest of the world. This led to one of the strangest decisions in Cold War history. The program was disguised not as a military project, nor a classified aerospace initiative, but as an expansion of civilian weather monitoring research. That way, new satellites could be launched without raising suspicion. Their true payloads would be buried in technical language no foreign analyst could decipher, buried under layers of scientific jargon and atmospheric data. And if anyone ever questioned it, the answer was easy. We're studying climate patterns. No one questions climate satellites, but the real objective was far more chilling. These orbital nodes were meant to map the electromagnetic signatures of every satellite above Earth, friend or foe, and store them in a network that intelligence officers simply called the ledger. Once the ledger existed, the Ghost Fleet would know how every major satellite communicated, maneuvered, corrected itself, and defended itself. With that knowledge, disabling them would become the simplest part of the mission. By the mid-1980s, the design stage was nearly complete. Prototype hardware had been tested. A silent orbital reshuffling of launch priorities had already begun. What the world saw was a routine expansion of civilian space infrastructure. What they didn't see was the emergence of the first true digital weapon of the space age, one that could have rewritten the rules of global conflict. And then, in the same way the Soviet Death Star died before it lived, the Ghost Fleet encountered the one enemy no nation has ever defeated: politics. While the Ghost Fleet moved quietly through the shadows of government bureaucracy, another force was gathering momentum, one far more destructive than any satellite or jamming platform. The Cold War was entering its most volatile phase, and the political winds inside Washington were shifting faster than anyone in the program could adapt. What began as a secret technological counterweight soon collided with the one thing no covert project can survive for long: public scrutiny. The first blow came not from Moscow, but from Capitol Hill. A series of defense budget hearings in 1986 exposed inconsistencies in space-related appropriations, nothing explicit, nothing incriminating, just enough stray numbers, unexplained expenses, and vague line items to raise suspicion among a handful of senators who were already skeptical of Reagan's massive military spending. They began digging, quietly at first, then more aggressively. Meanwhile, inside the intelligence community, a separate problem was unfolding. The data collected for the ledger, the electromagnetic fingerprints of every major satellite in orbit, had grown so massive, so detailed, that the network storing it became its own security risk. Analysts joked it contained the soul of the space age. If even a fragment leaked, foreign governments could reverse engineer American satellite vulnerabilities in days, and that looming threat triggered the second blow. A classified audit found that one of the subcontractor labs involved in the ledger's development had suffered a breach, not a fatal one. No confirmed data loss, but the mere possibility that foreign actors could have accessed anything connected to the Ghost Fleet triggered a full internal investigation. And worse, it attracted the attention of agencies that previously had no idea the program existed. For a project built on silence, every new pair of eyes was a step closer to collapse. Yet even as political pressure mounted, the engineers behind the Ghost Fleet continued their work with a sense of frantic urgency. They knew that once the world learned of Polyus, once the truth about the Soviet attempt at a space laser became public, the United States needed a credible response ready to go. Not a theatrical shield like SDI, but something real, something functional, something that could be denied publicly and deployed secretly. But then came the moment no one anticipated. In early 1987, a series of Soviet launches caught the attention of American infrared tracking systems. One of the thermal signatures didn't match any known propulsion model. Analysts speculated it might be part of the Soviet laser project. By pure coincidence, this was the Polis test flight, the same one destined to flip upside down and crash into the Pacific. But the Americans didn't know that yet. What they saw was a potential weapon in orbit, something that demanded a countermeasure. In internal memos, it was described as a moment of maximum strategic ambiguity. Some believed it was the Soviet Union, demonstrating that space would soon be a battlefield. Others suspected it was simply a bluff. But all of them agreed the United States couldn't afford to fall behind. That fear accelerated the Ghost Fleet prototype timeline. Suddenly, engineers were ordered to prepare the first operational node months ahead of schedule. It wasn't ready. The software needed additional fail-safes. The propulsion system required more testing. The consensus among the scientists was clear. Launching now would be reckless. But panic does not negotiate. A meeting was held behind closed doors, only a dozen people in the room. What was said that night has never been fully disclosed, but the decision that emerged was unmistakable. The United States would push forward with a limited demonstration of the Ghost Fleet's capabilities, not a full deployment, not a reveal, just a quiet test, something subtle enough that no one, not even the Soviets, would notice. It was a plan built on confidence, secrecy, and the belief that technical brilliance could overcome political chaos. It was also the beginning of the end. The demonstration was scheduled to use a civilian weather satellite as cover. The idea was simple. Attach an auxiliary module disguised as standard equipment, deploy it into orbit, and activate a limited test function that would gather signal telemetry from nearby satellites. It would be silent, invisible, undetectable in theory. But reality rarely bends to human intentions. On the day of the test, the auxiliary module deployed successfully. The telemetry feed stabilized, and for a brief moment, it looked as if the Ghost Fleet would achieve its first victory, a proof of concept born in silence, the kind of technological triumph that could change history without anyone ever knowing. Then something unexpected happened. A nearby communications satellite belonging to a foreign government experienced a sudden 17-second outage. It was brief, barely noticeable to most operators, but for intelligence analysts in that country, analysts who had been monitoring unexplained anomalies for months, it was the missing piece of a puzzle they didn't even realize they were solving. Within hours, diplomatic channels were buzzing with questions. Rumors spread through intelligence circles. Several nations began reviewing their recent satellite irregularities, searching for patterns. And on the other side of the world, in a conference room filled with Soviet officers, a startling conclusion was reached. The Americans had deployed the first operational weapon of the information war era. They were wrong, but their fear was real, and fear always demands a response. Inside Washington, panic rippled through the Ghost Fleet leadership. The outage was supposed to be impossible. The module wasn't designed to interact with foreign systems at all. Something had gone wrong, terribly wrong, and now the world was asking questions the United States couldn't afford to answer. A rushed internal review revealed the truth. The software had misinterpreted the signal environment, accidentally triggering a defensive failsafe meant to protect the module itself by momentarily blanketing a band of electromagnetic noise. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't espionage. It was an automated reflex. One line of code, behaving exactly as intended under the wrong circumstances, but no amount of technical explanation could change what happened next. The Senate began demanding briefings. Journalists caught wind of classified weather experiments. Rumors swirled in Washington. Think tanks about a shadow space program allies requested clarification. Rivals demanded accountability. The Ghost Fleet was no longer a ghost. It had become a political liability. And in a twist of fate that mirrored the collapse of the Soviet Polyus project, the United States found itself in the same position. A massive, expensive, secretive space program teetering on the edge of exposure, not because of technical failure, but because of human fear, bureaucratic pressure, and the unstoppable gravity of politics. By the end of 1987, the writing was on the wall. The Ghost Fleet's future was no longer determined by scientists or strategists. It belonged to the politicians now, and politicians rarely show mercy to ghosts. By early 1988, the Ghost Fleet existed in a strange state, too secret to defend publicly, too exposed to ignore, and too politically toxic to survive. Inside the Pentagon, the project's leaders watched the tide shift against them day by day, memo by memo, hearing by hearing. What had begun as a strategic shield, born from fear of Soviet dominance, was now being treated as an embarrassing relic of an era everyone suddenly wanted to forget. The collapse began quietly. Funding lines were trimmed, schedules were delayed, meetings that once included senior officials were replaced with vague emails and silent postponements. Engineers who had poured years of work into the prototypes found themselves reassigned to unrelated departments or pushed into early retirement. The project wasn't canceled, not officially, but it was being starved, suffocated by bureaucracy. And while Washington distanced itself, the rest of the world reacted in the opposite direction. Foreign intelligence agencies, already suspicious after the unexplained satellite outage, intensified their monitoring of American launches. Any deviation from a normal trajectory was scrutinized. Any unusual signal pattern was logged. Satellites that once drifted anonymously through orbit were now cataloged with obsessive precision. The space environment, once a quiet frontier, suddenly felt claustrophobic, crowded not with machines, but with paranoia. Meanwhile, in Moscow, a different kind of collapse was unfolding. The failure of Polyus, combined with the rising economic disaster inside the Soviet Union, had pushed Gorbachev toward a new doctrine. Transparency, reform, and de-escalation treaties were proposed. Inspections were negotiated. The idea of weaponizing space became politically impossible. And with each new agreement, pressure mounted on the United States to reciprocate. Behind closed doors, American diplomats made a calculation. The Ghost Fleet wasn't worth the cost. Not financially, not politically, not strategically. If de-escalation was the global trend, then a covert system designed to manipulate satellites without detection was the exact kind of project that could ignite an arms race all over again if it ever became public. And so, the final decision came not through a dramatic announcement, but through a single classified directive: cease operational development, secure all data, terminate covert launch capabilities. In other words, let the Ghost Fleet die quietly. But death, especially the bureaucratic kind, isn't a single moment. It's a long fade. Over the next year, the ledger was dismantled. Servers were wiped, Hardware was boxed and archived. The remaining prototypes, half built, half tested, half forgotten, were stored in facilities that officially didn't exist. Some say a few components were repurposed for civilian satellites. Others believe the most advanced modules were destroyed in classified burn pits, no one knows for certain, because the people who made those decisions carried the information with them into silence. And that silence became the legacy of the Ghost Fleet. For decades, the project remained hidden, mentioned only in fragmentary notes and heavily redacted reports. Even historians who specialized in Cold War intelligence dismissed it as either exaggerated or misunderstood or simply fictional. And perhaps that was for the best, because the Ghost Fleet was never designed to be famous. It was designed to never be known at all. But history has a way of resurfacing when you least expect it. As modern space programs accelerate, military constellations, anti-satellite missiles, electronic warfare platforms, echoes of the Ghost Fleet have begun appearing again, not directly, not in name, but in concept, in philosophy, in the renewed belief that controlling orbit means controlling the world below it. Nations are once again testing systems meant to blind satellites, or disable them, or jam them, or quietly rewrite the rules of space without ever admitting they're doing it. And if you compare the strategies of today to the architecture of the Ghost Fleet, the similarities are impossible to ignore. The ideas the United States buried in the late 1980s did not die. They simply re-emerged, repackaged in new technologies, carried forward by new fears. Which brings us to the part of the story that matters most. Because when you strip away the classified documents, the political calculations, and the technological ambition, the Ghost Fleet is not really a story about machines at all. It's a story about panic. About how a single misunderstanding, a misread Soviet test, an anomalous thermal signature, can trigger an entire nation to build something enormous in the shadows. It's a story about how fear creates inventions faster than reason can restrain them, and how silence, once broken, can unravel even the most sophisticated project the Soviet Union's Polyus burned up over the Pacific because of a guidance system error. The American Ghost Fleet collapsed because of politics, paranoia, and the gravity of secrecy. Two superpowers, two visions of power in space, both undone by forces they didn't fully understand. And now, decades later, with new geopolitical tensions rising and new technologies emerging that make the dreams of the 1980s look primitive, we find ourselves facing the same question that haunted that era. What happens when space becomes the battlefield again? Someone, somewhere, is working on their own version of the Ghost Fleet, or Polyus, or something far more advanced than either. And if history has taught us anything, it's this. These stories never end. They just wait for the next launch.